whom he declines to call pupils, and whose abilities, he will go on to make clear, were insufficient to carrying forward the torch. This, in short, is an instance where some kind of procreation, less metaphorical than the achievement of artistic verisimilitude, even if it was not so literal as the begetting of children, was lacking in the life of Michelangelo, in the underlined life, in the biographical material of it. Vasari steers clear of innuendo in this process of naming, though others, as we shall see, did not. But he is well aware of the general issue, as is clear from an anecdote that crops up both in his life and in the other contemporary biography of Michelangelo. The context has to do with the artist Francesco Francia, who appears in all of these texts as something of a jerk. Vasari presents him as a wannabe idolater of Michelangelo, who longs to see the work of the master, specifically the bronze statue of Pope Julius that was placed over the doorway of San Petronio in Bologna. Granted, finally, a view of the work, Francia stupidly declares che era un bellissimo getto e una bella materia. It is a most beautiful casting and a most fine material. My partner, who's a photographer, at the end of a show, someone came up to him and said how much they liked the frames. And they didn't mean the photographic frames. So he was, that person is certainly a jerk in our family. Same difference. In other words, praising the physical substance of the work and not the artistry. Michelangelo, at this point in the story, calls him a fool to his face. And Vasari goes on from there to a different anecdote. E di questo proposito medesimo, venendogli innanzi un figliolo del Francia, suddetto, che era molto bel giovanetto, gli disse: tuo padre fa più belle figure vive che dipinte. Translation in front of you. Both narratives, applied here to Francia and then to his son, are classic, indeed classical, with origins in Pliny and Macrobius. Whatever the literal truth of them as regards Michelangelo, it's clear that the circle around him told, retold, and published stories in which it is taken for granted, and with a certain backslapping pleasure, that he had an eye for the boys. There's more to this, I think, than a friendly acceptance of his erotic taste. In Condivi's version, the two stories are simply put next to each other as miscellaneous Francia anecdotes. The far craftier writer Vasari, on the other hand, links them with that phrase, e di questo proposito medesimo, which points to their significant interrelation. As it turns out, both are about matter versus art. If Francia does a better job with sexual than with artistic reproduction, it's because he is stuck in the material realm, capable of passing on his seed, but not of producing great works via his imagination or talent. But Michelangelo, whose nature does not incline him to passing on his seed, is gifted with the ability to recognize beauty. It's actually a point that receives a very abstruse treatment in his own poems, whether addressed to males or females. In other words, that it is his artistic eye that renders him emotionally or erotically susceptible. This is something 20 poems on that theme. In the version of the story retailed by the biographers, a similar claim is being made in what I would again call the vernacular form. But unlike the case with the master's own poetry, it's understood here as arising specifically out of Michelangelo's interest in persons of his own gender. Condivi, as it happens, was one of those disappointing young men who stayed in Michelangelo's house. And in his biography, written in competition with Vasari's biography, and in ways that betray close collaboration with the subject himself, he actually addresses the question of Michelangelo's interest in young men. He knows that Vasari has sidestepped an issue that others, notably Aretino, have insisted upon, namely gossip from, and I'm quoting him in translation, certain carnal men who are incapable of understanding the love of beauty except as lascivious and indecent. What follows in Condivi's life is a remarkable record of something like low vernacular Platonism. In his account of things, the story of Socrates' non-sexual bed-sharing with Alcibiades segues into Michelangelo's discussion of love, which are said to be exactly what appears in the writings of Plato, except that Condivi confesses he's never read Plato, so he's not sure what appears in the writings of Plato. But at any rate, he goes on to say, In lui non nascesse laidi pensieri. We do have the translation. Si può da questo anche conoscere che egli non solamente ha amata la bellezza umana, ma universalmente ogni cosa bella, un bel cavallo, un bel cane, un bel paese, like cheese, una bella pianta, una bella montagna, una bella selva. He gets around in his tastes. From which Condivi slides to the familiar topos of the bees gathering pollen from separate flowers, and finally to the equally oft-told story about the ancient artist who, rather than using one maiden as a model, chose the perfect features from several. Although Condivi doesn't name the artist, and he gets the subject of the portrait wrong, substituting Venus for Helen. This mishmash, to use the technical Italian Renaissance term, of classical pseudo-learning, may be the most interesting apologia we have for same-sex desire as regards the personage of Michelangelo. The passage, after all, begins with a quite risky assertion. Yes. Aetiam Dio amata la bellezza del corpo come quello che ottimamente la conosce. Et tal guisa amata, and then he cleans it up. How well did he know the beauty of the human body, and in what way? The question goes unanswered, except in a trickle-down from Plato that turns homoeroticism into almost a necessary condition for the kind of genius that is able to move from the appreciation of universal beauty to the reproduction of it in art. In the process, the harmony between homoerotic susceptibility and artistic genius, which underlies the Francia Jr. story, is more directly reasserted. But then there is finally, there's finally the voice of the master himself, perhaps the most explicit expression within this milieu that puts the sex back in homosexuality. It's a Michelangelo letter that has received rather little attention. Yes, that has received rather little attention. We cannot nail down the identity of the addressee apart from his given name, Niccolò, which is unfortunate, since it would help us understand the degree of intimacy that was necessary for the sentiments the letter expresses. What we learn from the text itself is that in the course of the previous evening, Niccolò, along with a friend of his, unnamed in the letter, encountered Michelangelo in the Canto dei Bischeri in Florence. The friend had a request which he apparently hoped Niccolò would promote. Michelangelo did not wish to grant the request, but didn't feel he could speak openly in the man's presence. And he writes the letter by way of explanation, he writes the letter to Niccolò by way of explanation. The man evidently wished to forward his son as a possible garzone, helper, assistant, apprentice. You asked Bizarro what to call him, but anyway, we'll call him garzone. In response to which Michelangelo had claimed the night before, disingenuously it seems from the tone of the letter, apparently the claim wasn't true, that he wouldn't need anyone for at least 2 or 3 months. The purpose of this evasion was to make sure the man didn't just leave his son with the artist in the fruitless expectation of eventual employment. And now we get to the good part. E lui non la intese, ma rispose che se io lo vedessi, I saw the young man, che non che in casa, io me lo caccerei nel letto. Io vi dico, says now Michelangelo to his person he's writing a letter to, io vi dico che rinunzio a questa consolazione e non la voglio torre a lui. He did not see the point in answer, saying that if I were but to see him, I should pursue him not only into the house, but into bed. I assure you that I will deny myself that consolation, which I have no wish to filch from him. Complicated issues of translation. I'm using Ramsden here. This, finally, is the smoking gun for a certain complex vision of Michelangelo's sexuality, as it played itself out at one particular moment in 16th century Florence. The letter is written to cover up an embarrassing situation, but the embarrassment has little, if anything, to do with unorthodox sexuality. It's apparently about the difficulty of saying no to a petitioner. Within the universe where this letter circulated then, there is nothing uncomfortable for any of the parties involved in imagining Michelangelo as a pursuer of young boys. Nor is there any strong opprobrium surrounding the fact that the father was, in our language, pimping his son. Indeed, when the great man hesitated on unstated, but certainly non-sex-related grounds to hire the lad, that becomes the cue for the father to play his trump card.